Assalamu alaikum. This is Hena Zuberi, and you're watching Muslim Network News. Our top story tonight: a new study highlights the extent of racial segregation in America's most populated areas. The University of California, Berkeley's Othering and Belonging Institute found the problem has become worse in the last 30 years. Over 80% of the regions with more than 200,000 residents were more segregated in 2019 than they were in 1990. This was despite federal fair housing laws and policies created to promote integration. The study showed that some of the most segregated areas included Chicago and Detroit in the Midwest, and New York and Philadelphia in the Mid Atlantic. In contrast, large metropolitan regions that saw the biggest decrease in segregation included Savannah, Georgia, San Antonio, Texas, and Miami, Florida. Out of the 113 largest cities examined, only Colorado Springs in Colorado and Port St. Lucie in Florida qualified as integrated under the study's rubric. The report noted that segregated communities of color have lower incomes, higher unemployment, and lower home values. They're also less educated than segregated white communities. However, it also found that Blacks and Hispanics who grew up in segregated white communities earned much higher incomes than those in communities of color. The Associated Press reports that the state of California will pay off unpaid rents that accumulated during the COVID-19 pandemic. The move will fulfill a promise made to landlords to help them break even while giving renters relief. The state has yet to decide whether it will extend the eviction moratorium, which was set to expire on June 30th. Newsom and other lawmakers are meeting privately about the issue, but there are disagreements on how long the moratorium should last. Charitable giving in the United States grew by more than 5% last year over 2019. The annual report on philanthropy released this week by the Giving USA Foundation found that U.S. charities received $471 billion and 44 cents during 2020. This makes it the highest year of charitable giving on record. The Giving USA report is the longest running and most comprehensive report on the sources and uses of charitable giving in the United States. Laura McDonnell is the chair of the organization. She attributes this record-breaking generosity to unprecedented developments during the pandemic. She also said this led to greater need and demand for services of nonprofit organizations. The generosity was also attributed to the stock market turnaround in the final months of the year, which boosted contributions. You may not know who the winner of the New York City primary for the mayor's race is for weeks. Since no candidate cleared the 50% threshold, ranked choice voting kicked in. This is the first mayoral primary in New York City to use ranked choice voting. This allows the voters to rank as many as 5 candidates in order of preference. This leads to subsequent rounds of counting, eliminating those with the least number of votes. New Yorkers are electing a new mayor for the first time in 8 years. Richard Scott William Hutchinson was born on June 5th in Minneapolis last year and was the world's most premature baby. His odds of survival were 0. When his mother went into premature labor, he wasn't due for another 131 days. He weighed less than 12 ounces at birth. But the little boy survived in the neonatal intensive care unit of the Children's Minnesota Hospital. Earlier this month, he celebrated his first birthday in good health. The icing on his birthday cake had a message from the Guinness Book of World Records. It said, "The most premature baby to survive." The hate crime unit of the New York Police Department are looking for a man connected to at least 2 anti-Muslim assaults in Queens on Sunday night. The NYPD released video late Tuesday night of a man they believe committed the 2 potential hate crimes within an hour. In the footage, he's seen punching a man and a woman while making anti-Muslim statements. He also tugged on the woman's hijab. About an hour later, the police believed the same man followed an older couple and uttered anti Muslim epithets against them. He then punched the woman multiple times in the face and on her head before fleeing on foot. A Muslim teacher is in the news for tweeting a summer reading list for Canada. Rabia Coker created a list of children's books centered around Muslim voices and authors. Themes of the stories included cooking with parents, music, belief in oneself, and adventure. Coker's past work in schools led to winning the Elementary Teachers Federation of Ontario 2020 to 2021 Anti-Racist and Equity Activism Award. Canada has seen a rise in Islamophobic attacks this month, resulting in the murder of 3 generations of a Muslim family in London, Ontario, earlier this month. A white supremacist has been charged on multiple counts of murder for the crime, as well as terrorism. In international news, Prime Minister Imran Khan says that Pakistan will not host American military bases. The statement came as the United States attempts to maintain a counterterrorism infrastructure in the region even as it withdraws from Afghanistan in September. Khan said that hosting U.S. bases would invite terrorists to target Pakistan again. Writing an op-ed piece in the Washington Post published yesterday, the Prime Minister offered to be a partner for peace in Afghanistan. He said Pakistan and Afghanistan both have suffered due to war and terrorism. Khan noted that more than 70,000 Pakistanis were killed during the American-led War on Terror from 2001 onward. He said that Pakistan made a mistake by supporting the War on Terror and he opposed any military takeover of Afghanistan. A detailed analysis is coming up in our show tonight, so keep watching Muslim Network TV. Over 82 million people around the world were forcefully displaced by war, persecution, and climate crisis by the end of 2020. This is a new record high, according to the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees. The statistics were issued in a new report by the UNHCR that came ahead of World Refugee Day last Sunday. The highest number of refugees came from Syria, Venezuela, Afghanistan, South Sudan, and Burma. The UN said that the crisis could get even worse in 2021, with possible famines threatening displaced people. Undeterred by fluctuations in the value of Bitcoin, an Islamic cryptocurrency coin has emerged. It's called Casecoin. Casecoin is the first certified Islamic cryptocurrency and blockchain network. It's designed to enable fast and cost-efficient international money transfers. The platform claims to prohibit its use in illicit activities such as money laundering, gambling, and drug sales. It also guarantees that no business with activities in areas such as arms, alcohol, pork, or tobacco production, as well as the adult entertainment industry, has access to its services. S&P Global Ratings says that the $2.2 trillion global Islamic finance industry is expected to grow 10 to 12% over 2021 to 2022. A socialist teacher and union leader, Pedro Castillo, has won elections for Peru's presidency. But fears are growing that supporters of the defeated right-wing candidate, Keiko Fujimori, will stage a coup to prevent the elected leader from taking office. With 100% of votes counted from June 6th, Castillo has a 44,000 vote lead. However, Fujimori is claiming election fraud without any evidence. She's calling for hundreds of thousands of votes, mostly from the poor Andean regions, to be annulled. China is really good at duplicating things. While religion is suppressed, Uyghur Muslims are facing genocide at the hands of the Chinese Communist Party. But the CCP still wants the world to think that Muslims are free to practice their faith. And they staged a fake Eid. In this report, Ali Khalaf and Saleh Farouk expose the real truth.
Muslims fast during Ramadan, and then they offer prayers on Eid Day and celebrate. But not in China, and definitely not Muslims in eastern Turkestan, which the Chinese call Xinjiang or New Colony. Uyghur and other Turkic Muslims are not allowed to fast nor pray. The police actually go around before dawn, raiding houses if the lights are on. The light indicates that someone is up early eating before fasting. However, this Eid, the Chinese Communist Party decided to fake the Eid. Yes, they created a fake Eid. Here is a clip broadcasted by Chinese state TV. Take a look before we break it down for you. The first thing to note is that this Chinese TV did not show any Eid prayers, because prayers are not allowed. That is consistent with the Communist China's policies. Second, notice the musicians, which are placed at the top of the mosque. As a matter of fact, it is against the Muslim culture to have musicians at the top of a mosque. It is also against the concept of respect among Turkic Muslims, but the Chinese producer probably has not studied Islam deep enough. Here is an earlier video of the mosque. In this 6-year-old clip, you can see a welcoming plaque with a statement of faith in Islam. It was still there 4 years ago in this CCTV video, and there was no Chinese flag. Even in September 2017, the multicolored scriptural plaque was there, but then the Chinese flag was added. It shows how gradually the character of a mosque was destroyed. 2 years ago in 2019, however, that faith-based plaque, which adorned its main entrance, was gone. A Chinese flag is also installed at the top of the mosque. There is hardly any mosque in any Muslim nation which installs a national flag at the top of the mosque. This is simply not done. But in China, those mosques which still exist are forced to install a flag, and in some mosques, a photo of the Chinese president is installed where God's name is written on the mihrab. Kashgar is an ancient Muslim city and an icon for the Islamic civilization. The Chinese Communist Party has erased the historic Islamic identity. This Eid-Gah mosque was in the center of a bustling heart of the Kashgar. The Chinese demolished houses to create this plaza for tourists. The BBC estimates that 16,000 mosques are demolished in East Turkestan. Thanks to tourists, this mosque still survives. A former imam of this mosque was arrested in 2017 and sentenced to 15 years in prison. The current imam at the mosque, however, denies religious oppression by the ruling Communist Party. The mosque structure dates back to 996 AD. It has a capacity for 20,000 people to pray, but Muslims are no longer allowed to pray here. Here is Aiden Anwar from US-based Save Uyghur campaign. Her family from Kashgar is missing 93 relatives.
I'm an Uyghur Muslim, and right now I have 93 relatives in East Turkestan, also known as Xinjiang, who we deem as missing, meaning we've had no contact with them for the past 3 years. We don't know how many are in these re-education camps and whether they are alive or dead.
Kashgar is almost empty nowadays. Most of its people are in the largest concentration camp since the Nazis. They cannot even practice their faith, except when the Chinese government forces them to dance. Dancing for the party and no prayers for Allah.
Coming up next after the break is our in-depth analysis segment. So stay tuned and we'll be right back after these messages.
If I could be you, and you could be me for just 1 hour. If we could find a way to get inside each other's minds. Walk a mile in my shoes. Walk a mile in my shoes. Well, before you abuse, criticize, and accuse. Walk a mile in my shoes.
Despite the development of a COVID-19 vaccine, millions around the world will not have access. We need a vaccine that's free and available to everyone, everywhere. It's time for a people's vaccine.
Welcome back. Earlier tonight, we shared the policy statement by Pakistani Prime Minister Imran Khan about not letting the US have bases in Pakistan. Let's go to Saleha Farouk for an in-depth analysis on the recent developments related to the Afghanistan peace process. Over to you, Saleha.
Thank you, much appreciated. Today, we're very happy to be joined by Matthew Ho, who is a former Marine as well as a senior fellow at the Center for International Policy. Matthew, I appreciate your time here today.
Assalamu alaikum, and thank you for having me with you.
Thank you. Now, as you might be aware, the Pakistani Prime Minister recently talked about the United States establishing a settlement before they decide to withdraw their troops from Afghanistan. If you can please talk to us about the potential impact of implementing a political settlement before withdrawing military bases from any country.
Well, that would be ideal. That really would be ideal to have a deal already in place that all sides agreed to. In Afghanistan's hard to say all sides because there's, as people know, there are so many layers to this conflict. It really is multi-layered, multi-sided. But to have the major players in Afghanistan, the major elements, the Afghan government, the Taliban leadership, the various warlords, as well as the United States and NATO, plus other countries that are heavily involved in Afghanistan that are in my opinion, interfering, the same as the United States is interfering, but interfering in Afghanistan's affairs and have been for decades, such as Pakistan, Iran, Russia, et cetera, India. Those nations, if you have an agreement, if you have some type of framework that is transparent, that everyone agrees to, everyone knows what the rules are, it's much easier for peace to be brought about because, again, people are now have this transparent agreement and you are trusting one another. And see, that's one of the biggest problems you have in conflicts, particularly a conflict like Afghanistan that goes back to the 70s, is how do you even begin to establish trust? Where do you even begin to have a mechanism that allows for a ceasefire, allows for people to return to some semblance of normality, allows for serious rebuilding and reconciliation to begin. And you need trust. And in order to have trust, you need to have some kind of mechanism to allow for trust to build. And so that is why having some kind of political settlement before the United States leaves, this is why a political settlement should have occurred back in 2001. Right, involving everybody, not like what the Bonn Agreement was. The Bonn Agreement was was the framework to form a new government in Afghanistan in 2001 after the fall of Taliban that left a lot of people out of that process, and that's why a lot of people say this is why we're in these circumstances 20 years later. However, yeah, it's very, very important to have some type of framework that will lead to, again, ceasefire, normality, rebuilding, reconciliation, et cetera.
Now, in Afghanistan, most people are fearing that withdrawing US military troops might leave the people dealing with a so-called weak Afghani government. Now, the Pakistani leadership, on the other hand, is far more influential and stronger in that region. What would have been the objectives of having a US military base in Pakistan then?
Well, and there have been U.S. military bases in Pakistan in the past. Most famously, about 10 years or so ago, we had secret drone bases in in Pakistan. And Pakistan has allowed for the overflight of U.S. military aircraft, including aircraft that are going to bomb Afghanistan. Pakistan has allowed for the transit of supplies to Afghanistan that have supplied U.S. forces and the Afghan government. But the benefit of having that, for the United States, what the United States wants, let me put it this way, the United States wants to maintain its empire, right? The United States has 800 military bases around the world. The United States sells the most weapons in the world. The United States provides weapons and military assistance to all forms of countries. The United States actually provides weapons and military assistance to 70% of the world's countries that are not democracies. So the United States' goal is to not lose the bases that we are losing in Afghanistan. So to have those bases in other countries allows it to be a zero sum experience where we still have those bases in the region. And this is mainly because the United States is not so much concerned about Afghanistan, but the United States is more concerned with Iran in China. And I've said this when I've been interviewed by Afghan networks. The United States is not interested in Afghanistan per se, but it's interested in being able to utilize and manipulate Afghanistan towards other nations, which of course would be China, Iran, Pakistan, Russia, et cetera. So that would be the goal, to find bases in other countries to still be able to have that presence in proximity to those nations that I just mentioned.
Thank you for that insight. Now, a lot of experts are anticipating a potential civil war in Afghanistan due to the US's 2020 peace deal that is aiming to bring home the troops. How can this potentially negatively impact its neighboring country of Pakistan?
Well, it's already been a civil war in Afghanistan since the 1970s. In 1973, the king is deposed. 1978, there's a major coup, basically a Marxist revolution that leads to the December 1979 invasion of the Soviet Union. A lot of people don't realize is that by the time the Soviet Union invades in December of 79, there are already 100,000 dead Afghans from the fighting. And the United States has been supplying the Mujahideen in Afghanistan for 6 months prior to the Soviet Union's invasion. And the war that has been going on since then has, in many ways, justly been called a civil war by many people. If you look at United States media before the United States entered the war directly in 2001, the United States media constantly referred to the war in Afghanistan as a civil war. It was only the fact now that you have the United States and NATO there that they changed the name. And now that those countries are leaving, the United States and NATO are leaving, it's going back to being called a civil war. But with regards to Pakistan, Pakistan has dealt with this, Pakistan has had to shelter millions of refugees from this conflict for decades now. There are millions of Afghan refugees, generations now of Afghan refugees living in Pakistan. Pakistan's western part, particularly the Pashtun area, has been a difficult region in terms of instability, political chaos, various revolutionary ideology that has led to great violence in the last 15 years. Particularly in the years following the explosion in membership of the Pakistani Taliban around 2005, 2006, 2007. You've seen a great threat to the Pakistani government. Of course, infamously, there's been some political assassinations, such as Benazir Bhutto, others. So Pakistan has been dealing with the direct and indirect effects of the war in Afghanistan for decades now, whether it be refugees, whether it be political instability, whether it be extremist groups, and then violence too. And certainly Pakistanis have had to deal with the brunt of the American drone program. Thousands and thousands of Pakistani civilians have been killed by the drones. According to leaked U.S. government documents, the United States drone program kills 90% of the people it kills are civilians. So the Pakistanis have been the one to have dealt with that. That's not to leave the Pakistani government and intelligence services off the hook. They have been very involved, and that's an understatement, I guess, in the war in Afghanistan. The Pakistanis have been very much involved in terms of providing weapons, intelligence, money, supplies, etc., to the various mujahideen and religious groups in Afghanistan that have been driving this conflict. So it's not as if Pakistan is an innocent victim, although there certainly have been tens of millions of Pakistanis who are innocent victims.
Now, a recent report from NATO revealed that while Pakistan does not want a Taliban takeover in Afghanistan, they are rather opting to strengthen the Afghani government. However, outside nations, as you mentioned, for example, India, are not looking for an interim government in Afghanistan. In your professional opinion, why is there a difference of thought here between Pakistan and India?
Well, for a long time, this gets to the heart of why Afghanistan has been a plaything, if you will, for both Pakistan and India. Of course, as folks know, Pakistan and India have gone to war many times since Indian and Pakistani independence in 1947. The goal of the Pakistani government was to create Afghanistan as almost a client state, so that Pakistan had more room, was a larger country basically in case India invaded. That's basically a very simple way to explain that. And India, of course, wanted to have a nation on the other side of its enemy, Pakistan, to cause problems for Pakistan, right? So you can understand how being Afghanistan where it is, as well as too sharing similar populations. Pakistan and Afghanistan both have very large populations of Pashtuns. That is a divided people. If people remember the Durand Line that the British set up that split Afghanistan from India, that many people still dispute. That is a very serious issue for many people, particularly Pashtuns. So for India, being involved in Afghanistan was a way to interfere with Pakistan, to cause problems for Pakistan, to basically have Pakistan having to be looking both ways, right, to its east and to its west. And for Pakistan as well, Afghanistan was a way to kind of make itself larger, allow for safe room, allow for itself to kind of be able to fall back further by having this cushion behind them. So I am suspicious of both nations, just as I am suspicious of the United States and other nations. It really comes down to what the intentions are. I do believe that that Pakistan does not want, and I've said this before as well, Pakistan is not interested in seeing the Taliban take over Kabul, just in the way that the Islamic State took over Mosul, because Pakistan knows that what will happen is that Kabul will end up looking like Mosul does now. The United States Air Force and Navy will return with their bombers and will level that city. And that will, as well as too, you're risking more refugees, something that Pakistan cannot handle any more of. And Pakistan, I think, after decades of trying this strategy of trying to manipulate, trying to control, trying to use violence to achieve its objectives in Afghanistan, I think there are people within Pakistan, not all in terms of their intelligence and military, not all of them, but some of them who've realized, look, this has been a failure. And the best thing for us right now is to try and get some form of stability, because this is being counterproductive. We are experiencing real difficulties because of the events that we helped begin and then sustained in Afghanistan. So I think that's why Afghanistan is interested in seeing a stable government where the Taliban, of course, is represented, but not one where other people are left out that continues to cause instability. But that can certainly change, though, with a change in the Pakistani government, though, in terms of its leadership right now.
Given this politically fragile situation, would you see any hope or solutions as well as recommendations emanating from the 2020 peace deal or from anywhere else?
I want to go back to what I said before about transparency. In these processes, transparency is so important. And that's why the deal between the United States government and Taliban in 2020 was was very poorly done. The Afghan government was left out of it. Pretty much anyone who wanted to be an observer was left out of it. There were these. If you go and you look up the Doha Agreement from February 2020 that the Afghan Taliban and the United States government signed, it's a short agreement. It's 4 pages long or so. But there are supposedly these secret annexes, these confidential annexes that have all the details, that have all the specifics. So how, and the Afghan government wasn't even allowed to see that. And then the Afghan government was dictated towards in terms of you will do this to honor the agreement. But again, there's no one has seen these agreements. So it's without that transparency, how do you know who is following the agreement and who is not? That allows for any group to say this other group is violating the agreement. So it says, allows for the Taliban to say the United States is violating the agreement, allows for the United States to say the Taliban is violating the agreement. I just read a thing today, again, a major U.S. media source saying the Taliban is not following the agreement. And there's nothing to say that based upon in terms of specifics from the agreement. Excuse me. So I think with going forward with this process, transparency needs to be a priority, as well as inclusion. Anyone who's left out, particularly those with any semblance of power and any ability to have a grievance, if they're left out of the process, if they're they can and will become a spoiler for the process. And that, of course, is extremely dangerous, because there are elements within all the groups that are negotiating for peace right now, the U.S. side, the Afghan government side, the Taliban side. There are elements within all three of those that want to see this peace process fail. And so they're looking for really any opportunity, any spoiling event to justify ending this peace process and beginning this war anew. And the great fear is if it does begin anew, not to say it's not currently going, because the violence is really terrible right now. But if it was to begin anew with, say, the reintroduction of U.S. or foreign troops, then I have no idea how you get back to the negotiating table, at least not for another generation or two.
A critical conversation today with Matthew Ho, who is a former Marine as well as a senior fellow at the Center for International Policy. Matthew, thank you so much for being here with us today.
Thank you.
Back to the news studio.
Thank you, Saleha. Before moving on to our next analysis, let's take a quick break. We'll be right back after these messages.
Our fellow Americans.
Right now, the COVID-19 vaccines are available to millions of Americans.
And soon, they will be available to everyone.
The science is clear. These vaccines will protect you and those you love from this dangerous and deadly disease.
They could save your life.
So we urge you to get vaccinated when it's available to you.
That's the first step to ending the pandemic and moving our country forward. It's up to you.
They took over my bedroom. Come on, come on. Okay, Dad. 1, 2, 3. Ah! Dad! You saved me.
I'm fine, dear.
Your hero needs you now, and AARP is here to help. Find the care guides you need at aarp.org/caregiving.
Welcome back. The For the People Act is now dead in the Senate. The bill had been introduced by Democrats as a way to strengthen and expand voter access for all Americans. Daryl West from the Brookings Institute is joining Imam Abdul Malik Mujahid for a detailed conversation. Over to you, Imam Mujahid.
Thank you, Hena. As expected, GOP filibuster blocked the major bill from Democratic Party in the Senate for voter reforms. What is next? That's the big question. And to discuss with that big question, we have somebody big on that. The Vice President of Governance Studies at the Brookings Institution, Daryl West. Welcome to Muslim Network TV.
Thank you. Nice to be with you.
So what do you think? I mean, this was expected. It will not pass. But what are your thoughts on this?
It wasn't a surprise, but it still is very disappointing that the Senate voted 50-50 on a major voting rights bill. The problem is there are a number of state legislatures across the United States that have adopted some very problematic bills that restrict voting rights. They're taking polling places out of minority neighborhoods because they know that they will end up voting Democratic by and large. They're changing the vote certification process. So in response to that, Democrats introduced legislation designed to counteract that and basically create some national standards to make sure that every state across the union respected basic voting rights and implemented best practices in terms of how to run the election. But unfortunately, a 50-50 vote in the Senate does not pass because Republicans threatened to filibuster the bill. It would take 60 out of 100 senators to vote to break the filibuster. Democrats did not have 60 votes, so therefore it ended up killing that legislation.
What has been the historic trajectory, civil rights movement, women's suffrage movement, everything was taking it upward. So what was the height of the voting right reform and where this thing went in the downward direction?
I'd say for the last 200 years, the United States has been moving in the right direction. Like if you go back to the founding, it was basically white male property owners who voted, which obviously was a very small proportion of the overall electorate. And then about 100 years ago, women got the right to vote. And then in 1964, America passed the Voting Rights Bill that basically removed many of the barriers that African Americans were facing. We gave 18 to 20-year-olds the right to vote. So the long-term history in the United States has been expanding voting rights and expanding the franchise. But I'd say about a decade ago, we started to move backwards in the sense that in some of the southern states that clearly had been practicing segregationist policies and creating lots of barriers for African Americans to vote, there had been lawsuits that gave the U.S. Department of Justice authority and jurisdiction to review state actions. And when states made major changes in their voting practices, they had to get sign off by the U.S. Department of Justice to make sure that the policies they were implementing were fair and equitable. There was a major Supreme Court case, I think it was in 2013, where the Supreme Court basically took away that pre-clearance requirement. So it basically allowed states to implement whatever changes they wanted without any clearance from the U.S. Department of Justice. And since then, we've seen a number of states start to pull back on voting rights, enact restrictive measures. And of course, this year, it's actually gotten a lot worse. So the country is at a dangerous point right now in terms of moving backwards as opposed to going forwards.
So what are the choices now that the Senate GOP bloc 50-50? That Senate seems to be more divided than the country itself. So what is the future looks like to you?
The battle is not necessarily over, although I would say this vote was a major setback for voting rights activists. But it's possible that some of the provisions that relate to budgetary issues in terms of the federal government providing resources to the states, that could be added to a reconciliation package. Reconciliation bills have to be budget related. And Democrats, of course, are trying to find votes for Biden's infrastructure bill as well. So it may be that they package a number of these budget related pieces together in one legislative package. And if they do that, that can pass on a 50-50 vote with the vice president breaking the tie in favor of Democrats. So that could be an option for some of the things to move forward. But anything that is not budget related cannot go through that kind of process. So it would not help on all the things where we need to safeguard our voters.
So every reform has to be tied with money to be discussed there, right?
Yes, absolutely. That's part of the reconciliation process, that it does have to be budget related. And there are, several parts of the voting rights bill that do involve money, so they could be packaged, but not all the things that we need relate to money.
Well, politicians are very skillful when putting money where they want something get done. So something will happen there. But tell me, is filibuster was used to block this move, which was very big for Democrats to fight off the states who are changing things left and right. Do you think some momentum will grow towards challenging filibuster itself?
I hope so, because the filibuster basically requires 60 out of 100 votes in the U.S. Senate to end the filibuster. The filibuster basically refers to endless debate that essentially allows the political minority to keep legislation from moving forward. And since Republicans are basically blocking almost everything Democrats want to do, I think they need to think about either an outright repeal of the filibuster rule so that they can govern and make policy on a 50-50 vote, or they can do what has been done in the past, which is to carve out some exceptions. So, for example, it used to be that any federal judge nominated to a court, that you could basically filibuster that nomination, and therefore it would take 60 out of 100 votes to end the filibuster. They changed that, and then they made the same change in terms of Supreme Court justices, and basically said you could not filibuster those things. So one option would be for Democrats to basically say, we're going to keep the filibuster as a general rule in the Senate, but things that affect the fundamental functioning of American democracy, such as voting rights, that is so important that we're not going to let a small group of people block consideration of that legislation. So that could be a way for them to move forward.
But the change to filibuster can be filibustered itself, don't you think?
Now, you cannot filibuster a rules change, so that can be implemented on a simple majority vote. So if all the Democrats stayed together, they could actually get rid of the filibuster entirely. The problem is the Democratic caucus is not united on this. There are several individuals who have already spoken out saying they don't want to get rid of the filibuster. Now, of course, there's uncertainty over whether they will allow a carve out of, let's say, basic elements of American democracy, and basically say you can't filibuster substantive changes in that area. But this is the real obstacle at this point. Up to this point, the Democratic caucus has not been united on getting rid of the filibuster. So until that changes, until they have at least 50 votes, we shouldn't expect any change to take place on the filibuster.
Now, one of the things which we noticed in 2020 elections was, and the same thing happened in 2000 elections, that when there was a conflict and debate and lawsuits, courts became inactive. I mean, at federal level, we have, governance is part of Congress, administration, and judiciary. The way the country is going, in which 30% people don't even believe Biden is legitimate president, and well, some of them believe that on certain date, Trump is going to be restored to legitimate presidency in their eyes. Judiciary has a role to play, whether it's appointed by this party or that party president. Now there are state bills which are written just to, disregard or delete the role of judiciary in terms of keeping an eye on the election fairness or attending to the complaint of the one side or the other. Is that a new phenomenon?
The courts certainly are going to play a major role in all of these voting controversies going forward. I mean, for example, the states that this year passed voting rights restrictions, there already have been lawsuits filed. So the courts will weigh in on the legality of some of these actions. What Democrats are alleging is that some of these bills are either unfair and therefore a violation of the one person, one vote principle, or that they are outright discriminatory, that they fall disproportionately on African Americans and Latinos, and so therefore they should be nullified in terms of racial bias. So the courts will definitely play a role in adjudicating those types of disputes. But the other thing that people should worry about in terms of the 2024 presidential election is, you may recall, in 2020, there was the issue on January 6th in terms of who would certify the vote coming in from each of the 50 states. And many states had provisions that either allowed the governor to sign off, the Secretary of State, or local election authorities to basically certify that Biden or Trump had won their particular state. Some of these states this year have already passed legislation changing the vote certification process such that it's the state legislature that certifies the vote. That could create a lot of mischief in the 2024 process, especially if it is a closely contested election, which people anticipate is likely to be the case, and if the losing party basically alleges ballot fraud, and then they will then go to the state legislature and ask them to throw out enough votes to allow the person who lost the election to actually be declared the winner. And so in some of the swing states where there is a Republican-controlled legislature, there's the very real risk that, let's say, if Biden runs for re-election and does very well in the popular vote, but let's say the votes in Georgia and Arizona are very close, the Republican legislature there could refuse to certify Biden's victory, claim that there was election fraud, use that to certify that the Republican nominee actually carried that particular state, and send that to Congress. That could certainly lead to lawsuits that will involve the courts, but it also involves the Congress in a very partisan way. So either one of those scenarios, whether Congress decides or the courts decide, that's going to be extremely contentious.
Do you think governance in a divided America is going to be more and more difficult, or you're going to come up with some solution in your think tank to resolve these issues?
Well, we actually do write regularly on these topics. A couple years ago, I wrote a book entitled Divided Politics, which looks at this whole issue of political polarization, how we became as divided as we have become, but also what some of the steps that we could take to reduce the polarization. So the polarization developed over a 40-year period. There were particular policy and political changes that took place. And so if you want to reduce polarization, it's a matter of unwinding some of those changes. And if we did that, I'm actually confident that polarization would go down. The problem is when you have a 50-50 country, it's hard to make the reforms necessary to address the root causes of polarization. So that definitely is a major barrier at this point.
Do you see polarization will lead to more of January 6th type of violence?
It certainly is a risk that there could be more violence in America's future. I think everybody was shocked with what happened on January 6th, but it doesn't mean that's the last time it's going to happen. And also, it doesn't mean that violence is going to be limited to Washington, D.C. You know, there are people in each of the 50 states who are upset with the way things are going. A number of people, especially Republicans, feel that Trump was robbed, that there was massive ballot fraud, even though there's no evidence to support that. They're angry, they're upset. There could be violence either in DC or in some of the state capitals. And keep in mind, the election process is a state level process, and the vote certification takes place at the state level. So you could have violence in a few key states that actually could be very dangerous. So I do worry about that. And the more divided America becomes, the more incentive or the rationale that people have to basically convert their grievances into actual violence.
In the divided America, divided information is playing a role. In recent Supreme Court announcements of their judgments, I saw CNN headline was extremely very different than the Fox headline. They both were focused on something completely different within the same set of decisions. And entered on a reception in a government law enforcement agency in Chicago. And on the television was Fox, and an officer was handing out the Fox sort of buttons to put on your coats, which I declined politely. But then recently I heard on military throughout, people are sitting and watching Fox by default. So it's the one set of information which is pretty preeminent in the law enforcement, and the judiciary, which has huge appointments from one side. Do you think the capacity of our country to govern itself based on the rules of the Constitution is diminishing?
Well, our media system is a big part of the polarization that we see, as well as polarization that is encouraged and facilitated by the internet and social media platforms. When you kind of add all these things together, traditional news media, internet, and social media sites, it's a very combustible combination at this point, because in a lot of respects, especially social media fuels polarization and encourages extremism. Some of the news sites have become very one-sided and very partisan in the way that they cover things. And so we shouldn't be surprised when Americans react in a polarized manner, because the information that they are being given is the information is coming in a very polarized and hyper-partisan framework. So that is a big problem right now. We have been writing a number of pieces, people can read them at brookings.edu, on ways to improve our news media system, ways to improve social media, promote more accountability. The large platforms actually can develop algorithms that slow down the dissemination of clearly false information. So, for example, there are people who are opposed to vaccines and are spreading false rumors to basically discourage people from getting vaccinated. The social media sites are starting to use algorithms to identify the spread of false information of that sort, to basically try and limit the destructive ways in which some of these sites have operated up to this point.
Well, thank you so much, Daryl West. I truly appreciate you being with us once again from the Brookings Institution.
Thank you very much. Nice to be with you.
Back to you, Hena.
Thank you so much, Imam Mujahid and Mr. West. That's all from our Washington studios tonight. Thank you for tuning in. You can find previous episodes and more on our YouTube and Facebook. For more content, keep watching Muslim Network TV or visit muslimnetwork.tv. Assalamu alaikum and good night.